So that's the main thing I want to learn. And learn is a very complex process. You can be interested in ants or in cockroaches. They are as interesting as some philosophers. If you really do it serious and find things out. You know? So when I, for example, after finishing my high school degrees, which I did rather old, with 24, because I had been 10 years optician before, in a completely different profession, because I came up from a very low educational background, elementary school. And in this time I was a rather successful businessman. I worked for the American Army, opening shops for them, optical shops, selling glasses, you know. And so after that I said, okay, that's it. I know how to make money. I want to do something else and concentrate on things that I'm really interested in. And I decided to hitchhike to India. In 1964, I just wanted to widen my horizon. That's why I hitchhiked for half a year to the east. But and that was important for what should turn out to be very important for a certain period of my life. On the way back from India, I just went to Western India, Bombay, and not what I did later on. I came to Aleppo, and I did a lot of drawing, you know, simply. And more it came to me, well, how close European civilization, European architecture is close to Islamic architecture, and where is the difference? And how did this difference come up, and how did similarities survive? But finding different configurations. And so in Aleppo I decided, drawing things, details on the citadel, I do Oriental studies. I started to learn Arabic, Persian, older Semitic languages, including Hebrew, older Iranian languages, Middle Persian and Old Persian and so on. So, but since I was older and had experience simply in business, I was much more organized than other students. So I finished my PhD with 5.5 years, you know, from 0 to 5.5 years. And I started with a PhD thesis on one part in the south of Iran, a medieval province called Arajan. And there I used methods that were then, and still are, not followed by many, or almost none. The combination of philology and archaeology. So there I followed my scholarly ideals, the French Sauvager and the German Herzfeld, who did this in the first half of the 20th century, simply to try to get the stones and the words together. To do this, one does not need only, philological training. One also needs a kind of archaeological art historical training. So what I did if I just follow up my books in a chronological sequence. What I did after my dissertation, which is very rare for a PhD, the thesis published by the Vienna Academy in their special Denkschrift, Memoirs of the Vienna Academy, I wrote 2 books on segments of archaeological, philological, auxiliary sciences, as we call them. That means numismatics and epigraphy. And the book on numismatic, it dealt with the earliest Islamic coins in Iran. And these were a very interesting mixture between pre-Islamic types of coins, script, and Islamic names. So you have, for example, names of Arab governors of Iran, of parts of Iran, written in Middle Persian, not in Arabic. So this is one thing that always accompanied my my work, simply the transition periods from the pre-Islamic, immediate pre-Islamic period to the early Islamic period. And so I worked quite a lot on things change from the Sasanian administration, religion, and so on, architecture, of course, to Islamic architecture. And the same I did in some articles, long articles I wrote, also on Syria. The question, how did this new Islamic architecture develop from what there was before? Which elements were put in there and why? So the question also, the social questions, the historical question reflected in architectural form. So the transition periods were always very interesting for me. The same as in later periods when foreign rulers came in, what did they bring into the nuclear countries of Islam, and what stayed and what was modeled. A new political class, a new social class, a new religion, as far as Islam, for example, is concerned, a new ethnic group with different backgrounds, come on a set civilization and society. And where do things change? And where do things persist? This is a very important question, which can be only seen if you look from the backward, and from the beginning forward. How do these things intermingle? And for these contaminations, we have different very good examples through, for example, Islamic architecture. We have a radical change in many things in Bilad Sham, in Greater Syria, which was first the center of the first real Islamic state. So Byzantine elements or Syro-Byzantine elements were used by a new ruling group, and a new philosophy behind this group for their buildings. And this group who came from Inner Arabia, the first ruling class in Islam, they, of course, they did not have all means. The Arab Peninsula was developed, but not as highly and refined developed as a Byzantine society or the Sasanian society. So what is interesting, for example, in Belat Sham and Greater Syria, which elements did the new class, the Arabs, take from the one side and what from the other side? So the most spectacular thing is, for example, they took what there was in Syria, the bath, the hammam. In Iran it didn't exist. It was prohibited because the Persian religion, for the Persian religion, the water is holy. You cannot dirty the water. So it was no way that in Persia you had bath in the pre-Islamic period, except one king who introduced them, and he was in later Zoroastrian writings, and well, he was a heretic and so on and so on. Then you did not have this kind of, well, horsemen, let's say, civilization as you had it in Iran, as the Arabs were also riding people. And they liked open air, whereas the Byzantine palaces and the Roman palaces are very often in cities. They like to live outside or have secondary countrysides. So what did the Arabs in Syria? They adapted things from the Persians and they mixed them with things they found in Greater Syria, Byzantine Syrian traditions. So that's one element, for example, of contamination. Simply you have different plans of buildings or changes using existing plans but mixing them with others and create something new, which is a very complex process. I wrote one book simply to show that we have a pre-Islamic Arab tradition of architecture in certain areas of Syria, which were taken over by the early Islamic rulers because they reflected a kind of tribal political concept. And for this type of buildings they built in the desert was characteristic. And we have it also already in the pre-Islamic period, because the Arab vassal rulers of the Byzantines, they did exactly the same thing. They had to be the heads of a confederation of tribes, of clans. Otherwise they could not exercise power and they could not stand themselves against the Byzantines up to a certain degree. Same you have in Iran, or you have it later, to come to a later period. We have in Iran a very significant period that when the first, let's say, national ideas, anti-Arab ideas came up in Iran, these military leaders or whatever who came into power, they suddenly introduced Persian titles. They didn't call themselves Malik or whatsoever anymore. They said Shah. And they produced even medallions, not coins, but this memory medallions with Middle Persian inscriptions on them. 300 years after the coming of Islam to Iran. And we have this then continued in a very important event in Islamic architecture, the invention or the origin of the Persian mosque. if we look at mosques, what does a general person know? Hagia Sophia, the blue mosque after the model of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul in the Ottoman state, and the complete different concept we have in Iran, in Central Asia, and in India, in Eastern Islam, the Persian mosque, which made a total break with what we had before in Iran, a very simple hall-like type of mosque architecture. They introduced suddenly a large courtyard with typical Persian architectural elements. The Ivan, open, on one side open, large hall facing the courtyard, and the dome. That's simply under Persian, and later they were followed by Turks. So local Iranian dynasties and then Turkish dynasties, or one mainly the Seljuks, they introduced in the architecture a Persian or Iranian nationalism, because they quoted the Ivan and the dome as an element of pre-Islamic Persian architecture. I think it's important. A good scholar is also an artist, because scholarly work is not a bookkeeper's work, it is a creative work. Simply to look at things in a new way, highly personally and in time, of course, directed. I mean, what you think today about a certain period. You know, in 50 years people think different because they are socially different formed. So the history of what I'm doing is mainly historical stuff, of course. This is, of course, a product of my time, of my political attitudes, of my society, of my friends, of everything that I like and what shaped me. You know?